You know, President Bush at the time, President Bush came to Mississippi many, many times. But the second time, we went to a feeding station. It was less than 2 weeks after the storm, and the Salvation Army had set up this big tent. We still didn't have electricity. We didn't have electricity for 12 days, which, by the way, was the fastest we'd ever gotten electricity back on after a big hurricane. But we went to this feeding station, and I always made it my habit, Marcia and my wife and I, we'd get away from the president just because people wanted to meet him. People were thronging around him. Well, I noticed there were a bunch of trucks over here and some guys standing over there. So I said, come on, Marcia, let's go meet them. And I shook hands with all of them, and finally, they all had funny accents. I finally asked one of them, I said, where are you from? He said, Vermont. I said, really? He said, yeah. And I said, how'd you get here? He said, oh, I drove one of these trucks. He said, the governor called on TV after this storm for us to try to bring down food and supplies and whatever. And I said, and you drove that truck down here from Vermont? He said, oh, yeah, all of us did. And then he said, it's my third trip. It's my third trip. Less than 2 weeks after the storm. But you saw that so often, and that's what's wonderful about what you do for helping those that need help, but for giving people a chance to be part of this, to get the reward of helping people who need help. I mentioned the church groups were so incredibly important to us. The Olympics had been, and the Winter Olympics had been in Salt Lake City, and there was a Mormon company that had built the temporary housing for the Winter Olympics. And they called and said they wanted to come down and help. They wanted to build a kind of a little village, if you will. And would we welcome? We said, golly, come on, you know, we're tickled to have you. And they finished building this huge tinted facility, and they asked Marcia and me to come to the grand opening, which we did. They had a luncheon. Well, as soon as we drove up and you looked under the canopy on the other side of the place, the area where people were eating, was a big RV, and it had painted on the side, Adventists in Action. So here we are at this Mormon facility. The Seventh-day Adventists are doing the cooking, and I couldn't resist, so when I got to speak, I asked people about their faiths or their religions, and most of them were Baptists and Methodists, but there were just all sorts of everything here at the Mormon deal, eating the Adventist food. As we finished and walked to the car, a little man came up to me and introduced himself and said he was from New York and how glad he was to be here. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, Governor, yesterday I talked to my son, who is a rabbi, to ask him, should I return to New York for the High Holy Days? And he said, I've never not been, you know, in the synagogue and where in the High Holy Days. And he said, my son told me, no, Dad, stay where you are. I think you are closer to God there than you would be if you came back for the High Holy Days. Now, this, as you go forward in your work, I know I don't have to tell you how important the faith-based groups are. I also want you to understand that we saw firsthand and see to this day the groups that aren't generated by churches or synagogues or mosques, but the kids from AmeriCorps who are just phenomenal. Again, they came within a few weeks. They lived in deprivation. I'll tell you what, if we put the prisoners in the state penitentiary living in the same conditions as the AmeriCorps kids lived in, we'd get sued and we'd lose. It's just phenomenal. And Teach for America, I mean, this is not all about disaster recovery. When you see the kids that come to our state for Teach for America, it's just phenomenal. And I want to say to you as a governor, as somebody who has been the recipient of these good deeds, thank you, and keep it up. And know that in our country there are tens of millions of people who want to be your ally, who want to help, who want to get the chance. I'm going to close by telling a little story about my hometown. I grew up in Yazoo City, Mississippi. In fact, Marcia and I still live there. It's about 40 miles up the road from Jackson. And Yazoo City in April of 2010 had a devastating tornado that destroyed about 300 homes in a town of about 14,000. So it was a huge tornado that at times was more than a mile wide and stayed on the ground in a rural area of the town, a more sparsely populated area of the town, for more than 5 miles. 4 fatalities. We saw it coming, and so Marcia and I got my wife, and we went to Yazoo City and got to the town about 40 minutes after the tornado hit. And it hit on the southeast corner of town where there's a big highway intersection, and you could just see this unbelievable devastation. We got out, there's already some highway patrol there and some first responders. But we hadn't been standing in the parking lot for 2 minutes when I heard this voice say, "Hey, Mr. Haley." And so I turned around and I couldn't figure out who said it. And then a young man about 35 years old walked over to me. And he said, "Mr. Haley, you don't remember me, but I'm Simon Stubblefield's grandson, and I played Little League against Sterling, my older son." And he said, "This is my brother Jimmy." Well, these two young men lived in a part of town that wasn't hurt. Within an hour, they drove up in their pickup trucks. They had their 4-wheelers in the back. They had chainsaws slung over their chests like Minutemen, and spoke to me just long enough so I could say, "Hey, Simon, it's nice to see you." They got on, they didn't look for anybody to tell them what to do or how to help, but they took off down the road to start clearing the road, to start taking rubble off of people who were still in their houses in less than an hour. I bet there were 50 of them who were there within the first hour and a half. There are people who are dying to help. And if one of the great charges you have is to be the instrument to allow them to help. I applaud you for it, but I want you to know it matters. What you do matters. God bless you. Thank you.